about to lose my mind. One step away from the red line.
Welcome to this week's episode of Unspoken Truths Trauma in the Black Community. I'm Dr. Laretha J., and today I will explain historical, intergenerational, and racial trauma, as well as racial discrimination, and how patterns, experiences, and wounds are passed down through families. For purposes of these discussions, the terms Blacks, Black people, and African Americans will be used interchangeably. Before I jump into this week's episode, let's recap episode 2 titled Trauma. In episode 2, I defined trauma, which is an emotional response to a terrible event. It can be physical, emotional, or developmental in nature. I defined the 3 types of traumas, which are acute, chronic, and complex. I explained the consequences of trauma, which include behavioral, emotional, and physical. I briefly touched on trauma in the Black community, and that was by design because today's episode will cover this in detail. Lastly, I suggested ways to heal trauma like formal psychotherapy, counseling, faith-based methods, creating supportive networks, and more importantly, by practicing self-care. If you missed episode 2, be sure to check it out. Episode 3 is focused on trauma from a historical, intergenerational, and racial perspective. The objective of this episode is to define historical, intergenerational, and racial trauma, define racial discrimination, highlight how these traumas affect the Black community, and lastly, I want to share ways to break intergenerational curses to facilitate healing. Now, let's begin with historical trauma. According to Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, a Native American social worker, associate professor, and mental health subject matter expert, historical trauma is the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding that occurs over one's lifespan and across generations, originating from massive group experiences. This collective trauma evokes a variety of responses, most prominently through substance abuse, which is often used to temporarily numb pain. Now, take note of the word temporarily, because once the substance wears off, the numbness goes away and the pain resurfaces. According to the American Psychiatric Association, these historical traumas have plagued the Black culture for more than 400 years. It began in the early 1600s with chattel slavery. Chattel slavery was a dehumanizing system where enslaved people were considered personal property of their owners, not temporarily, but for life. People who were enslaved were treated as a commodity, which allowed them to be willed, traded, or sold like animals or furniture. Now imagine that. What's more disturbing is that enslavers had complete control over the bodies and lives of those they enslaved. And then check this out, as well as their children. Now let that sink in. From chattel slavery, things transitioned to the Jim Crow era, which was a racial caste system where Black people were treated as second-class citizens and subjected to legal segregation, which mandated separate facilities for Black and white people. This included schools, hospitals, restaurants, restrooms, water fountains, transportation, you name it. And political disenfranchisement, which restricted voting rights. Black people were prevented from participating in politics at all. Economic and social hardship, where Black people had limited economic opportunities. To relieve the pressures from discriminatory treatment, Black people took it upon themselves to migrate to northern and western cities like New York and Chicago in search of better opportunities, and violence across the American South and other states. This included lynchings and mob violence where Black people were murdered. Think about the traumatic impact on our Black community. People suffer greatly. These injustices fueled Black people to explore nonviolent, and I said that like that, nonviolent ways to push for equal rights. Examples of this were the Montgomery boycott, in which Rosa Parks, a civil rights activist, was arrested on December 1st, 1955, when she refused to give up her seat to a white man. This led to a 381-day boycott, which served as a pivotal event in the civil rights movement. And in November of 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. This was a major win for Black people. Another example is the first Woolworth sit-in, which was a nonviolent act that took place in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 1st, 1960. There were four fearless and trailblazing Black North Carolina A&T University freshmen that sat at a whites-only counter at Woolworth's department store. Even though they were refused service, they remained seated until the store closed. Their courageous act sparked the nonviolent sit-in movement that helped desegregate public businesses and further the civil rights movement. Another example, the March on Washington that took place on August 28th, 1963, was a major demonstration that also pushed for civil rights legislation. Following Jim Crow was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was a major step in the movement for equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It ended racial segregation in public places. It established the EEOC to enforce fair employment practices by prohibiting discrimination against a job applicant or an employee based on their race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, childbirth, or related conditions, transgender status and sexual orientation, national origin, age 40 or older, disability, or genetic information. The Voting Rights Act came right after that in 1965, and that enabled African Americans the right to register and vote. Up next was the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, this act was designed to protect people from discrimination when renting or buying a home, getting a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaging in other housing-related activities. More importantly, the act prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. I think everyone would agree that these changes were major improvements for Black people. However, we need to now talk about post-Civil Rights Act changes. There were landmark legal precedents, such as Griggs versus Duke Power, that happened in 1971. And this was a groundbreaking case for racial discrimination in the workplace that set a powerful precedent for eliminating unfair employment practices. Then the McDonnell Douglas Corporation versus Green, that case was in 1973, and that established a framework for proving intentional discrimination, also known as disparate treatment, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I talked about the EEOC earlier, but the establishment of the EEOC was also significant because what they did was they enforced Title VII's prohibition of race and color discrimination. The EEOC has filed, resolved, and adjudicated a number of cases since 1964. There have also been improvements in political representation, which has had a significant impact on the political landscape. While there are several, the two that come to my mind are President Barack Obama's historical election, which took place in 2008. The Black Lives Matter movement, which occurred during the pandemic, also brought awareness to systemic racism, police brutality, and racial inequality. Even though progress has been made, there are ongoing challenges that we continue to face as a Black community. More specifically, discrimination continues to be a reality for many of us, such as being subjected to gender, racial, disability, and age discrimination in and outside of the workplace, or being denied housing based on a person's race or disability. Black people also face economic disparities where we experience disproportionately high unemployment, poverty rates, and pay as compared to other ethnic groups. Then there's the criminal justice system, where disparities exist in policing. There are numerous cases, as we know, of racial profiling, such as driving while black. These injustices have forced parents to teach their children what to do in the event that they're pulled over so that they can come home safely. Prosecution and sentencing, whereby minorities experience harsher sentencing outcomes than others. Incarceration rates that are significantly higher for Black people than white people. Access to legal representation, where people from marginalized communities are unable to afford private legal representation, therefore are forced to utilize public defenders, which may lead to unfavorable outcomes. Yep, I know that this is a lot to unpack, but it's important to understand the negative impact that historical trauma has had and continues to have on the Black community. Now let's talk about intergenerational trauma. According to the American Psychological Association, intergenerational trauma is the transmission of trauma or its legacy in the form of a psychological consequence of an injury or an attack. It could be poverty, other things as well, so on and so forth, from the generation that experienced the trauma to the current generation and those that come behind. The trauma reactions vary by generation, but often includes shame, increased anxiety and guilt, a heightened sense of vulnerability and helplessness, low self-esteem, depression, substance abuse, dissociation, intrusive thoughts, difficulty with relationships and attachment to others, difficulty in regulating aggression, as well as extreme reactivity to stress. I know it may be hard to believe, but all of these can be passed down through genetic changes, cultural transmission of beliefs and behaviors, or through direct exposure and learned family patterns that indirectly affect descendants. Let's talk about each one of these, starting with genetic changes. Genetic changes can lead to scars on the DNA that can be passed on to descendants. An example of this is sickle cell anemia, which is a blood disorder that is caused by a specific mutation in the gene, or Down syndrome, where individuals have an extra copy of chromosomes 21. Cultural transmission, on the other hand, are family and societal narratives and worldviews related to original trauma, which are then adapted and passed down through generations. Joy DeGruy, author of the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, mentions in her book that if a traumatic experience is severe enough, it can also distort attitudes and beliefs, which in turn validates this concept of cultural transmission. I actually have a copy of her book here in the event that you're interested in getting that. Examples of cultural transmission include traditions and practices where children are taught religious rituals like baptism or weekly church services and the power of prayer. Or you have family traditions like holiday gatherings, which we do. A lot of people do soul food Sundays and things like that. And in the summertime, we have family reunions. We have the T-shirts that has the family tree listed and everything. We also have cookouts. And then for those of us who like to get up on Saturday morning and clean and listen to music, that is also a tradition that has been passed down. When it comes to direct exposure and learned behaviors, parents who experience trauma may adopt inadequate coping mechanisms like substance abuse to numb their pain, which I mentioned earlier, or self-harm such as suicide, You have social isolation where they're just withdrawing from everything. Emotional eating, which often leads to obesity and ultimately creates other health issues. Avoidance, risky behaviors, and aggression. All of these, which I often refer to as a trauma response, can adversely impact their behavior and emotional responses, which in turn affect the development of their children. Lastly, we have environmental factors. These are societal factors like ongoing discrimination and oppression, which can be considered stressors that perpetuate the effects of generational trauma. Research has shown that sustained intergenerational trauma has led to poor physical health, psychological distress, a devaluation of self, an erosion of family ties, and a weakened community connection. Now let's explore racial trauma. According to research, racial trauma or race based traumatic stress refers to the cumulative effects of racism on an individual's mental and physical health. Racial trauma has been observed in numerous Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, affecting people of all ages. Racial trauma may surface in response to racism that evoke stress and trauma reactions and may be recurring, systemic, and intergenerational. I said it before and I'll say it again. Research has found that among people of African ancestry living in the U.S., racial trauma has contributed to poor physical health and psychological distress. Now we have racial discrimination, which is defined as discrimination against an individual based on their race, ancestry, ethnic, national origin, skin color, or hair texture. Racial discrimination can take on several forms, including microaggressions, such as a white person implying that a Black person is not as intelligent by saying, "Oh, you're very articulate," or "so and so would handle the situation like this." My response is always, if that's the case, well, go and get so and so to do it. Or if you're natural like me, can I touch your hair? The latter actually happened to me in the workplace, believe it or not. I was totally caught off guard and taken aback because the person didn't ask to touch my hair. Rather, she took it upon herself to pat my hair like I was a pet poodle. I won't go into details about how it ended, but I assure you it was definitely what I consider to be a teachable moment for her. Other forms of racial discrimination are prejudice, which is an unjustified feeling or belief toward an individual or group based on their alignment to that group. Said differently, it's the forming of an opinion with no facts to support it. You have overt bias, which is an open, intentional, and conscious expression of prejudiced attitudes and or beliefs. You have stereotypes, which are assumptions people make about others based on that person's affiliation to certain groups. Racial profiling. We know this is a common practice in law enforcement where individuals are targeted for stops, searches, or investigations based on their race, ethnicity, nationality, or religion instead of for suspicious activity or behavior. There are also subtle forms, such as failing to hire, train, mentor, or promote a racialized person. Now, let's take a look at a few examples of how these traumas affect the Black community. Collectively, historical, intergenerational, and racial traumas have a negative effect on the Black community as it creates persistent disparities in physical and mental health, which leads to chronic stress and damaging psychological well being. From a physical health standpoint, and we talked about some of these in episode 2 when we talked about trauma, also in episode 1 when we talked about ACEs. Physical health. So you can have like cardiovascular disease, accelerated aging, an increase in infant and maternal mortality rates, a chemical imbalance in the brain, and more. And from a mental health perspective, it can result in anxiety and depression, hypervigilance, internalized racism, distrust, and fear, and more. Let me be crystal clear. This is not an exacerbation. In fact, African Americans have endured immeasurable race related traumatic events on a national scale for decades. Examples of these traumatic events include the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, where a white mob destroyed the prosperous Greenwood district, known to many as Black Wall Street. That massacre resulted in 100 to 300 people being killed. Then you had the Rosewood Massacre of 1923, which was a racially motivated assault on a predominantly Black town in rural Levy County, Florida. This resulted in the town's complete destruction, and it occurred in January of 1923. The violence was triggered by a false accusation from a white woman who lied about being raped by a Black man. White mobs took what she said and ultimately burned down the town and killed the Black residents. Then there was the infamous government sponsored Tuskegee syphilis experiment that took place from 1932 to 1972. The study was supposed to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis. There were 600 males who participated in the study. 399 of them had latent syphilis, and the remaining 201 were not infected. They served as the control group. There was a level of deception that took place in which the men who had syphilis were never told they had it. Instead, researchers informed them that they had quote unquote bad blood and promised them free medical care, free meals, and free burial insurance. And even after penicillin became the standard effective treatment for syphilis in the mid 1940s, researchers withheld that information from the infected men and actively prevented them from accessing treatment from other sources. Talk about grimy. This is a prime example of why Black people don't have a high level of trust when it comes to the healthcare industry. Now we're going to talk about redlining. So, redlining originated in the 1930s. This is another issue that adversely affects the Black community. It did then, and it still continues to do so in subtle ways, of course. It is described as government-sanctioned housing discrimination that allow private and public lending policies to systematically deny Black Americans home ownership and wealth accumulation in desirable neighborhoods. Then you have the Los Angeles riots of 1992. That was a direct response to the acquittal of 4 LAPD officers who were involved in the beating of Rodney King. We then go on to incidents of police brutality, and we have so many to count. I'm only going to name a few. George Floyd, who was age 46, he was murdered on May 25th of 2020 in Minneapolis. He took a knee to his neck, which obstructed his breathing and resulted in his death. One of the officers involved was actually sentenced to prison. You have Breonna Taylor, who was fatally shot in her Louisville, Kentucky apartment on March 23rd of 2020. Her boyfriend shot at an officer that he thought was an intruder. In response, 2 detectives fired a total of 32 shots into the apartment, of which 6 struck and killed Miss Taylor. Then we had Eric Garner, age 43. He was killed in New York City on July 17, 2014, for selling loose cigarettes. Nobody was charged in his death. Michael Brown, age 18, he was fatally shot to death on August 9th, 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, while walking down the street with a friend. Nobody was charged in that death. Tamir Rice, a young tender age of 12, was fatally shot on November 22nd, 2014 by police while playing at a park in Cleveland, Ohio. Nobody was charged in his death. They said he had what appeared to be a gun. The COVID 19 pandemic also created disparities. The disproportionate effect that it had on the Black community is believed to be a compounding traumatic event. There were systemic racial inequalities in healthcare as well as other institutions. Racism in the U.S. had also consigned many Blacks to jobs of high public contact. In fact, African Americans make up most of the quote unquote essential workforce, including 30% of bus drivers and 20% of food service workers. This information was retrieved as of 2020. Given this, African Americans are more susceptible to contract COVID 19 due to systemic racism that historically carved out the type of work they are obliged to perform, including deliberate neighborhood and school segregation policies, which currently explain their increased workplace and environmental exposure to COVID 19 infection. Numerous studies have confirmed that COVID 19 has impacted the lives of African Americans, including their mental health, at a rate higher than other social or racial ethnic groups. As a result, a greater proportion of African Americans now suffer from stress, anxiety, and depression that was caused by COVID 19. Despite these unconscionable acts, the Black community continues to exhibit resilience, courage, creativity, faith, and strength. Talking openly about trauma doesn't erase that strength. Instead, it deepens it because it means we're finally taking back our power by allowing space for truth and healing. By developing a sense of one's cultural identity, engaging with social support, and communicating the consequences of racism, breaking these historical and intergenerational patterns and healing from trauma is possible. Now, let us discuss methods to break historical and intergenerational patterns. Breaking these patterns begins with awareness. Gaining an understanding of these intergenerational patterns is a critical first step to healing. Take time to educate yourself by learning about trauma, the effects of trauma, and how it is passed down from generation to generation. Shift your mindset to remove those harmful narratives and instead replace the negative thoughts with positive affirmations. I am beautiful. I am a conqueror. I am worthy, and any others that you deem helpful to aid you in the healing process. Change your behaviors by refusing to succumb to unhealthy patterns that have been passed down from prior generations. Instead of believing everything that has been passed down to you, do your own research so that you can avoid passing down false narratives to your children and grandchildren. Reframe the narrative to adjust the language you use to describe your trauma and your life. Instead of saying, I am broken and unworthy, replace it with, I've been through a lot, but I am more than worthy. Set healthy boundaries. Take control of your life by putting up barriers to protect your physical and mental well-being. If relying on faith and spiritual beliefs work for you, then continue down that path, but make sure you engage others to support you along the way. Is it possible to heal from historical, intergenerational, and racial trauma? It most certainly is. And ways to do this are to identify unhealthy patterns and seek professional help, or you can engage in open conversations with positive influences, whether it be with a therapist, a family member, a friend, or others that you consider to be a trusted advisor. For those of you who know me, you know that I don't use the term trusted lightly because not everyone can be trusted, especially when it comes to something as sensitive as mental health. You can practice self care. I'm sure everyone would agree that self care is the best care, and it's necessary to ensure that we are able to be the best version of ourselves. Depending on the severity of the trauma, you may need the support of medication. This should be a last resort, as I'm not a proponent of taking medication. For me, if it's not natural, I'm not taking it. But I do realize that in some cases, medication may be critical in the healing process. So do what's best for you to ensure you get the treatment you need. Another method is to accept and forgive yourself and others involved in causing the trauma if possible. While it may be painful, this approach can help in the healing process. Remember, forgiveness is not for the other person, it's for you. Again, there are numerous ways to heal. However, these are just a few suggestions. Nevertheless, adopting healthy approaches will facilitate our healing today in hopes of creating healthy, positive patterns for future generations. With this being said, it's incumbent upon you to take hold and set the trajectory for your life. This wraps up this week's episode. For your convenience, I included several links in the description if you want to learn more about this topic. In closing, I want to thank you for joining me for another episode of Unspoken Truths, Trauma in the Black Community. Remember, your voice matters, your healing matters, and together we will rise. If today's conversation resonated with you, or if you know someone who can benefit from the information shared, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to share knowledge and experiences. It's important to understand that no one should ever feel as though they must walk this path alone. With the proper support systems in place, we will rise above the adversities caused by trauma. Join me next time as we continue speaking the unspoken and healing the unseen. Until then, stay strong, stay rooted, and remember, collectively, we will break generational curses one person at a time. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share.